This is how I sew my granny squares together using the mattress stitch to create an invisible seam. I used a contrasting color to show how invisible this seam really is. And while it's a tougher seam than the whip stitch, it's not quite as flat as the whip stitch, but I have a little bit of a workaround for that. With the right side of the granny square facing me, I'm going to feed the needle from the back to the front in between the loops of the first corner chain. Then I'm going to take my other granny square and I'm going to feed from the front to the back in between the loops also of the first chain, and then I'm coming back out from the back to the front in between the loops of the next chain. Then I'm working back into the first granny square. I'm inserting my needle into the stitch that I came out of originally, and I'm weaving it in between the loops of the next chain to start my zigzag pattern. Then I'm going to go back to my second granny square, and I'm going to work into the stitch I came out of last, weave it in between the loops of the next stitch, and pull the needle through. And we're just going to keep zigzagging this way. So I'm going back into where I came out of, then I'm weaving it in between the loops of the next stitch, and it's just going to keep going back and forth like that. By only picking up one loop, I'm minimizing the bump in the back while creating a nice little border on my granny chains once they're sewn together. And I do try to pull it tight as I go, not super tight, but pretty snug so that at the end it's an even seam all the way across. Now that I've reached the end of this side, I am going to flip it over just to show you, and then here I'm just going to pull it tight one more time, and the contrasting yarn is hidden really well. If you were to use a matching yarn, you couldn't even see it. Now in the next part, I'll show you how to do the corner piece where we're intersecting all the granny squares, and it'll be linked in the comments. I also made a granny square playlist if you want to check out my other videos on the granny square. This is how I sew my granny squares together using the mattress stitch to create an invisible seam. I'm going to start the side of these two granny squares the same way I did in part 1. And the biggest thing I want to point out when you're working this 4-piece intersection is that I'm just working into the first chains of the 2 chains that are in the corner. And I'm still using the same method that I did along the side with the mattress stitch, going into the stitch I came out of last, and then weaving in from behind to the front, in between the loops of the next stitch. The mattress stitch is my preferred method because I can lay my blanket out flat. I don't have to fold anything on top of each other. Nothing's getting twisted or tangled. And as I'm going, I can check to make sure that I'm not skipping any stitches, because the borders of my granny squares are going to let me know if I skipped a stitch. I also think it's super satisfying when you are pulling the yarn tight and you watch it kind of close up like a corset, but that's just me. I've also never had the seam come undone in the wash machine or in the dryer, but that's it for now. There are many other methods that you can use to sew your granny squares together, but I'm going to come back to those later because sewing granny squares together is one of my least favorite things to do, besides attaching all the body parts of an amigurumi project. So the next few videos are going to go back to the stitch tutorials and projects and, you know, the fun stuff.